This next section will discuss the various programs and policies to increase Indigenous participation. The government has several policies and programs in place to increase the participation of underrepresented groups in federal procurement. As an Indigenous business, you should familiarize yourself with these policies and programs and leverage them to accelerate your entry into the federal marketplace. The Federal Indigenous Procurement Strategy, launched as a procurement strategy for Indigenous business, has been instrumental in encouraging Indigenous businesses to do business with the federal government. The procurement strategy for Indigenous business leverages existing government procurement needs to create opportunities to generate wealth in Indigenous communities and to close socioeconomic gaps by increasing Indigenous participation within the procurement process. The procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses has a mandate to enhance the creation, growth, and long-term viability of Indigenous businesses by assisting them in competing for and winning procurement opportunities. The government has established target under this mandate to have at least 5% of federal contracts awarded to Indigenous benefits. By registering your business on the directory, you will gain several benefits ranging from increasing capacity to gaining further exposure to other opportunities. The Indigenous Business Directory is commonly used by private companies seeking suppliers. We recommend pausing the screen to read the highlighted benefits. To qualify for the procurement strategy for Indigenous business, an entity must be sole proprietorship, limited company, cooperative, partnership, or not-for-profit organization in which Indigenous persons have majority ownership and control, meaning at least 51%. In the case of a business enterprise with 6 or more full-time employees, at least 33% of the full-time employees are Indigenous, and as part of a joint venture agreement, an Indigenous business or Indigenous businesses, as defined above, have at least 51% ownership and control. Requirement that Indigenous content be at least 33% of the total value of the work to be performed. Value of work is the total value of the contract less any material directly purchased by the contractor for the project. You may pause the screen to read and understand the details. Under the procurement strategy for Indigenous business, the government utilizes 5 procurement mechanisms to increase Indigenous participation. They include 1. A mandatory set-aside used for procurements over $5,000 that are destined for an area, community, or group in which Indigenous people make up at least 80% of the population and where the Indigenous population will be the recipient of the goods, service, or construction. 2. A voluntary set-aside which may be employed if Indigenous capacity exists and operational requirements, best value, prudence, probity, and sound contracting management can be assured. 3. A conditional set-aside may be used when it is impossible to determine Indigenous business capacity. Procurement is initially open to Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses. However, if 2 or more Indigenous businesses submit a bid, then the procurement becomes a set-aside for Indigenous businesses. 4. Incidentals exist where procurement has not been set aside. For example, open tenders where Indigenous businesses compete with non-Indigenous businesses and where an Indigenous business, as defined by PSIB, wins the contract. 5. Indigenous participation components are different than the other PSIB approaches, given that they encompass more than only procuring with Indigenous-owned businesses. They also include Indigenous hiring and training, and grants, bursaries, and scholarships for Indigenous people and communities. A portion of the value of a contract, either a percentage or a dollar value, is set aside for Indigenous participation. A prime contractor can achieve their Indigenous participation component through the combination of Indigenous hiring and training and providing grants, bursaries, and scholarships for Indigenous peoples and communities. We recommend pausing the screen to read the highlighted benefits. There are a variety of tools and approaches used by the government to assist Indigenous businesses in understanding the government's procurement process. For example, various training sessions are provided for Indigenous businesses and communities. There are also tools available to assist Indigenous businesses in gaining exposure not only to government agencies, but also to private companies, provincial and municipal governments through the marketing tools offered and registering in the Indigenous Business Directory. Then, there are approaches in place to ensure the mechanism are being properly used and Indigenous businesses meet with the PCIB eligibility requirements. In addition to the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses, there are other programs and policies in place to create Indigenous participation in the government supply chain. These include 1. Comprehensive land claims agreements, which includes measures dealing with procurement, and although these measures are not always identical in the various agreements, they are all aimed at enhancing economic opportunities for the Indigenous groups benefiting from the agreement, usually through increased opportunity to compete for contracts in their settlement areas or of participating in employment, training, and/or subcontracting opportunities. 2. Industry and Technology Benefits Policy, which was launched in 2014, enables the government to use defense procurement as a tool to build industry capacity and to facilitate Canadian companies to enter global supply chains using industrial offsets. Bidders are encouraged to identify skills, development, and training opportunities for Canadians. This pillar may also consider Indigenous peoples, communities, and businesses in the defense industry. 3. Indigenous benefits plans enhance economic opportunities for Indigenous peoples and businesses through increased possibilities of competing successfully for contracts or by participating in employment, training, or subcontracting opportunities. For example, the contract for the administration of the Canada Student Loans Program, awarded by PSPC on behalf of Employment and Social Development Canada, stipulated that a portion of the services needed to be delivered by an Indigenous subcontractor.